I'm Dr. Mark Padilla from Global and Sociocultural Studies at Florida International University, and we're doing a LACC tutorial on research on heavy metal music in Latin America. And we're here with Dr. Nelson Varas, who is also a member of the faculty in Global and Sociocultural Studies. And I think in order to start out the conversation, we had talked about doing a brief clip of some of the music that you're analyzing. So maybe before we get into the discussion, we'll just jump right into that clip for a moment.
Sure, let's do that.
Un homenaje a esos héroes, pibes, hombres de solo 18 años que los mandaron a una guerra desigual. Pero la guerra no empezó en el 82. La guerra empezó hace 500 años. Por eso el próximo tema se llama 500 años. Más fuerte, 500 años.
Ay, si coreamos todos. Ay.
Okay, so let's discuss what this clip means in terms of your research. Maybe you can describe
Sure.
a little bit of what that.
That's a clip of Argentinian metal band Tren Loco, which is in Spanish for Crazy Train. And that's one of the oldest running metal bands in Argentina. And I chose that clip to start this conversation today with LACC because it's part of an album that they released almost a decade ago called Sangre Sur, Southern Blood. And that song is entitled 500 años de qué, or 500 years of what. And it's Tren Loco positioning metal as a critical strategy towards colonialism in Latin America. And I thought that was interesting because part of what I'm trying to do with my research is kind of answer the question, the larger question of what is it that metal does? You know, most people think of music as entertainment. When you look at metal music, it's evident that there's something more going on there. There's a critical positioning towards particular projects of modernity, right? Or critical positioning towards society in general. And there are particular bands within Latin America that have decided to engage in a critical agenda towards the project of coloniality.
Mm.
And they have kind of tackled three main issues that I think are important historical points in Latin American development throughout music. The first is the colonization process, characteristic of the 15th century that we all know by now. The second one is the process of the internal dictatorships that emerged throughout Latin America. And the third one is kind of like the current state of coloniality in Latin America, which has to do with neoliberal policies that are privatizing land and water supplies, for example. So metal music kind of goes about criticizing coloniality by tackling those three main large subjects.
Mm.
And I thought Tren Loco was a great example because it's a way, it's in your face, it's outright decolonial, and it's a good manner of introducing people who kind of want to tackle Latin American metal in terms of what it is that they're saying.
Yeah.
You know? So it's not just this myth of sex, drugs, and rock and roll that people associate with rock music and metal music. There's something really critical, well thought out positioning going on there in heavy metal in the region.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because people don't associate, as you suggest, don't associate heavy metal music with that kind of critique. And I wonder why metal? Do you have an interpretation or an understanding of why heavy metal artists are engaged with these themes in particular?
Well, there's been a lot of academic work in terms of how metal music positions itself against or critically assesses the project of modernity as a whole.
Mm.
So there's this whole notion of criticizing the idea of progress as something that's constant and unwavering, right?
Mm.
There's criticizing issues like religion and society and social structures, social oppression. So there's a critical project embedded in metal, in most of it, I would say. And I think research has shown that. What I think is missing in part of the research agenda with metal music is how that changes in different regions throughout the world.
Mm.
And in Latin America, the colonial experience, it's right there in your face. You just have to fly to any country in South America and you're going to see the consequences of coloniality there.
Mm.
Some older, some newer, but it's there. And metal music in the region has actually decided to tackle that head on. So some bands like the ones that you just saw address the issue of coloniality in general. Others address issues of neoliberal policies. Like, for example, I've been working with a band called Crisálida in Chile, and they work with issues of water privatization, for example. So it's subject matters that you wouldn't expect musicians to tackle.
Yeah.
So it's very common to have conversations with metal musicians in Latin America, and they will outright state, we're not here to entertain you.
Yeah.
We're here to make you think.
Very interesting.
And from an academic standpoint, it's interesting not only because it's music, but because this particular type of music has been kind of related or ascribed to the more problematic alleged problematic consequences on youth, for example, associated with suicide, depression, drug use.
Mm.
And what you notice when you delve into it in a deeper manner through a researcher's lens is that its agenda, it has another agenda.
Mm.
It has a more critical agenda.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting because I've spoken to some scholars in the Caribbean who think that heavy metal doesn't exist in the region. They're not even aware that there's a heavy metal culture in the region.
Right.
So I think it would be interesting if you could present a little bit about your research in both the Caribbean and the wider Latin America. You've gotten some recognition globally and won some awards for some of your documentaries, and I think it'd be interesting for you to trace a little bit of that history of your own work and how it's evolved.
Well, our team has been very fortunate to be able to publish our work in traditional academic journals and books, but also translate that work into documentary film. Because anybody that does work in academia knows that you publish your paper and then having that paper be read by a large number of individuals is kind of like the hardest part. So we were trying to find a way to have an academic discussion with a larger audience. And ethnographic film does that for us. Documentary film allows us to do that.
Yeah.
So we started developing these films, and we did one based on the metal scene in Puerto Rico, tackling issues like the use of language, metal in Spanish, colonialism, identity, resistance, community, academic subjects, but through the lens of metal music and through the outlet of documentary film. And that kind of motivated our team to start visiting other countries in the region. So we did a second documentary focusing on the scene in Cuba and the scene in the Dominican Republic, and that went over really well. It's been shown in at least 10 international film festivals, so it's made its way around the world
and won several recognitions.
Some of them, yeah. So it's been an interesting experience for me as a researcher to kind of learn how to have a conversation with a very different audience that's more interested in things like what type of camera do you use or what type of editing software do you use. So it's been a learning process for me too as a researcher, and I've had to kind of learn to speak a different language, which is good because it's basically a different methodological discussion. And now what we've done is, since we already did the Caribbean, well, we thought, well, maybe we should start working in South America. And we've just completed recording in Mexico, Chile, and Argentina, and are recording a couple of weeks from now in Peru, trying to get a sense of how metal music has developed and what it does in parts of Central America and South America. So it's an ongoing project of trying to document these scenes and answer that larger question: what does metal do in Latin America? And hopefully that'll come out as a third documentary.
That's great. Yeah, I can't wait to see how that develops. So, and could you say a little bit about how you link your work to research? Because some people might not quite understand how, in terms of a social scientist who's working in global and sociocultural studies here at FIU, how you link heavy metal music and the documentaries to your analysis, because you're also doing academic research on these bands and metal in general. Could you talk a little bit about your process of how you analyze?
There's a host of things that one does from an academic perspective when working with bands in these countries. So part of it has to do with, it's multi-method. So part of me does things like lyric analysis to try to understand the meaning behind what they're singing about. Part of me does a basic ethnographic observation to try to understand the cultural setting in which they're embedded. Part of me has used questionnaires to assess levels of community involvement in some of these scenes. We've, of course, done qualitative interviews. So there's a host of different research techniques that go into understanding that larger question of what metal does in the region. And what's gratifying for me, and I think it makes me grow as a researcher, is that it forces me to be able to handle multiple research techniques at the same time. So I think I've grown as a researcher while traveling and interacting with these musicians, which I think it's been good for them and for me.
Fantastic. Well, I think this is just a little taste of some of the work that Dr. Varas is engaged in. I think it's a huge resource for FIU and for LACC and for GSS to have you here. And so we invite all of you to get to know Dr. Varas more and some of his work that he's conducting on heavy metal music in Latin America.